society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This, of course, is the famous quotation from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Now, the doctrine of the noble savage also had a great deal of emotional appeal. It implied that there was no need for a domineering Leviathan, a government and police force, to keep us from each other's throats. If we're basically nasty, then conflict is a permanent part of the human condition, and we have to get used to it. If, on the other hand, we're basically noble, then we can work for a utopian society of the future. Children are born savages, that is, uncivilized. So if the inner savage in us is nasty, it means that child-rearing is an arena of discipline and conflict. Whereas if the inner savage in us is noble, it means that child-rearing consists of providing children with opportunities to develop their potential. We continue to see an influence of the doctrine of the noble savage in modern intellectual life. We see it in the respect for everything green and organic, and a distrust of anything man-made, as in natural childbirth, natural medicines, natural foods. We see it in the unfashionability of authoritarian styles of child-rearing. And we see it in an understanding of our social problems as repairable defects in our institutions, in contrast to a traditional view in which they would be seen as part of the inherent tragedy of the human condition. And there's a third doctrine that accompanies the blank slate and the noble savage, commonly associated with this man, the philosopher René Descartes. Descartes wrote, "When I consider my mind, I cannot distinguish any parts, but apprehend it to be clearly one and entire. The faculties of willing, feeling, conceiving, etc., cannot be said to be its parts, for it is one and the same mind which employs itself in willing and in feeling and in understanding. But it is quite otherwise with corporeal objects, for there is not one of them imaginable by me which my mind cannot easily divide into parts. This is sufficient to teach me that the mind or soul of man is entirely different from the body," a doctrine which 3 centuries later would be derided as the doctrine of the ghost in the machine. And the man who coined that was Gilbert Ryle. It was not coined by the Police, even though they used it as the title of one of their albums. The ghost in the machine has a great deal of emotional appeal. We don't like to think of ourselves as just glorified hunks of machinery. Machines are insensate, built to be used, and disposable. Humans are sentient, possessing of dignity and rights, and precious. Machines have some workaday purpose, like grinding corn or sharpening pencils. Humans, we like to think, have a higher purpose, such as love, worship, and the pursuit of knowledge and beauty. Machines follow the ineluctable laws of physics, whereas behavior is freely chosen. With choice comes optimism about possibilities for the future, and with choice also comes responsibility and the power to hold people accountable for their actions. Finally, if the mind, as Descartes suggested, is entirely separate from the body, that holds out the hope that the mind can survive the death of the body, an idea whose appeal, I think, is all too obvious. Like the other two doctrines, we continue to feel the impact of the ghost in the machine. We see it in the fact that freedom, dignity, and responsibility are often seen as incompatible with a biological view of the mind, which is often denounced as reductionist or determinist. Now, no one really knows what these words mean, but everyone knows that they refer to something bad. We see it in the stem cell debate, where some of the theologians advising George W. Bush on stem cell research claim that it should be outlawed because harvesting stem cells from 5-day-old blastocysts occurs after the moment of ensoulment, and therefore is tantamount to murder, which means that perhaps the most promising medical technology of the 21st century is being debated in terms of when the ghost first enters the machine. And we see it in everyday thinking and speech, as when we talk about John's brain, which seems to presuppose some other entity, John, that's separate from the brain that it owns. Or when we see journalists speculate about brain transplants, whereas, in fact, they really should call them body transplants, because as Dan Dennett once pointed out, this is the one transplant operation in which you really want to be the donor, not the recipient. Well, it should come as no surprise that I think that these doctrines are deeply flawed, beginning with the blank slate. And the fundamental problem with the doctrine is that blank slates don't do anything. The inscriptions would just sit there forever unless there was some innate capacity to interpret their meaning, to combine them with other inscriptions, and to use them to organize behavior in pursuit of goals. No one denies the central importance of learning, socialization, and culture in all aspects of human life. The only question is, how do they work? And when Locke said there is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses, I think the ultimate riposte came from Leibniz when he said, except for the intellect itself. And indeed, the modern sciences of mind, I think, have posed a number of threats to the blank slate for these reasons. My own field, cognitive science, has tried to spell out how many innate mechanisms you need to do the learning that human beings undeniably do. They would include some kind of concept of an object and of causation, a number sense that allows us to conceptualize numbers separate from the entities they enumerate, a set of spatial representations that the brain uses to keep track of where things are and allow us to navigate in the world, a theory of mind or intuitive psychology that allows us to infer the thoughts and feelings of other people, a language instinct that allows us to communicate our thoughts to others, and executive systems of the frontal lobes that integrate information from other parts of the brain and carry out reasoning and decision-making. Evolutionary psychology has undermined the blank slate by documenting human universals. Now, though it is undoubtedly true that there are very important differences among cultures, which anthropology has called to our attention, in addition, there is a bedrock of human universals, patterns of thought and feeling that can be found in all human beings. The anthropologist Donald Brown has recently tried to catalog universal traits as documented by ethnography, and he's found so far some 300 of them, everything from aesthetics, affection, ambivalence, and antonyms, all the way down to verbs, violence, visiting, vowel contrasts, weaning, weapons, attempts to control the weather, and the color white. Now, evolutionary psychology has undermined the blank slate in another way by showing that many human drives can't be understood as ways that people maximize their happiness and well-being, but rather can only be understood as adaptations to an ancestral environment, the one that we evolved in and are designed to pursue evolutionary goals. An obvious example is our taste for sugar and fat, which sends many people to an early grave from eating too much junk food, but which was clearly adaptive in an environment in which these nutrients were in short supply, and so one could never get too much of them. Very recently, we've invented technologies that can crank out mass quantities of the stuff. Our tastes have not caught up, and we therefore eat more of them than are good for us. Another example is the thirst for revenge, which has led to enormous suffering in the forms of vendettas and blood feuds and cycles of violence, but which was one's only defense in a world in which one couldn't dial 911 to get Leviathan to show up when one was threatened. But a willingness to retaliate with violence and a reputation for toughness was the only defense against becoming a permanent punching bag. And less obviously, I think it explains our paradoxical desire for attractive mates. Now, the humorist Fran Lebowitz, I think, once made an insightful observation about our psychology. She said, people who marry someone that they're attracted to are making a terrible mistake. You should really marry your best friend. You like your best friend more than you're apt to like anyone you happen to be physically attracted to. You wouldn't pick your best friend because they have a cute nose. But that's all you're doing when you're getting married. You're saying, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with you because of your lower lip. Now, this indeed is a paradox, but I think it's resolved by research from evolutionary psychology showing that the physical signs of attractiveness are cues to health, fitness, and fertility, and by wanting to have children with someone with those features, you're combining your genes with other genes that have the best chance of leading